Emily Carter had learned how to live alone long before she learned how to trust someone again. At 32, she had built a life that looked steady from the outside, freelance marketing work she could do from anywhere, a modest apartment in Arizona, routines that kept her days predictable and her nights quiet. Friends described her as independent, composed, someone who didn't need much. What they didn't see was the fatigue that settled in after years of starting over, relationships that never quite held, conversations that promised connection but ended in silence. She didn't meet Ryan Mitchell looking for a rescue. She met him during one of those late nights when the apartment felt too still and the glow of her phone filled the room. His profile didn't stand out at first. No flashy photos, no exaggerated confidence. Just a man from Ohio with a calm smile and a short bio that said he worked in IT and preferred real conversations over small talk. Emily swiped right without thinking much of it. The first messages were cautious, almost formal. Then they stretched longer. Ryan asked questions most men skipped, about her work, her childhood, the places she wanted to see but never had. He listened. When Emily talked about feeling stuck, about wanting something solid instead of temporary, Ryan didn't interrupt or offer solutions. He told her he understood. He said he wanted the same thing. Weeks turned into months. Their conversations moved from text to nightly phone calls. Ryan's voice was steady, unhurried, the kind that made silence feel comfortable instead of awkward. He talked about Ohio as if it were quiet and grounded, a place where life didn't rush past you. He described his apartment, his routines, the stability he had built after years of focusing on work. He spoke about commitment like it was a choice, not a burden. Emily found herself imagining a life that didn't feel so fragmented. She pictured waking up beside someone who knew her habits, her moods, her flaws. Ryan talked about her visiting at first, then about her staying longer. Eventually, he said it plainly. If you came here, he told her one night, we could finally stop living half a life. Emily didn't answer right away. She stared at the ceiling, phone pressed to her ear, feeling the weight of the words. She had promised herself she wouldn't uproot her life for someone she'd never met. She had said that after the last disappointment, and the one before that. Still, the idea settled in her chest and refused to leave. Friends were cautious when she mentioned Ohio. They asked why he hadn't come to Arizona instead. They reminded her how much she was giving up. Emily heard them, but she also heard something else, the quiet fear that if she didn't take this chance, she might never take one again. Ryan didn't pressure her, at least not openly. He said he understood if she needed time. He said he didn't want her to feel trapped. But he called every night. He asked about her packing plans before she'd made them. He talked about where she'd put her things in his apartment, about cooking dinner together, about routines that sounded domestic and reassuring. Emily began to prepare in small, practical ways. She sold furniture she didn't need. She told her landlord she might not renew her lease. She stored boxes at a friend's place, just in case. Each step felt both exciting and terrifying, like walking forward while knowing there was no easy way back. The night she booked the flight, Emily sat alone at her kitchen table, laptop open, finger hovering over the confirmation button. She thought about everything she was leaving, her independence, her familiar streets, the quiet control she had over her own life. She also thought about the loneliness that crept in every evening, the sense that she was waiting for something that never arrived. When the confirmation email appeared in her inbox, she felt a rush of relief followed by a sudden, sharp fear. She called Ryan immediately. "I bought the ticket," she said. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then his breath quickened. "You won't regret it," he said. "I promise." Emily wanted to believe him. She told herself that trust had to start somewhere, that every meaningful relationship required risk. She told herself she was strong enough to leave if things didn't work out. At the airport, her friends hugged her longer than usual. One of them squeezed her hand and whispered, "Call me the second you land." Emily smiled and nodded, brushing off the unease that flickered across their faces. She didn't want doubt to follow her onto the plane. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, Emily watched the desert fade beneath the clouds. She felt suspended between who she had been and who she hoped to become. This wasn't an escape, she told herself. It was a choice. A step towards something real. She didn't know yet that the decision to leave, made in hope, fueled by loneliness and trust, was also the moment she stepped into a story she would never be able to walk away from. Emily landed in Ohio just after sunset. The airport was smaller than she expected, quieter, wrapped in a gray stillness that felt heavier than the desert air she had left behind. Ryan was waiting near the baggage claim, standing slightly apart from the crowd, hands in his jacket pockets. When their eyes met, he smiled quickly, like someone checking off a long-anticipated moment. Their hug was brief. Not awkward, but not warm either. Emily told herself it was nerves. After months of talking through a screen, it made sense that reality would need time to catch up. The drive from the airport was mostly silent. Ryan pointed out a few landmarks, a grocery store, an exit he took every day for work, but his voice felt different in person. Flatter. More controlled. Emily watched the road stretch ahead, reminding herself that first impressions were rarely complete stories. Ryan's apartment sat in a quiet complex on the edge of Dayton. From the outside, it looked ordinary: brick walls, identical balconies, dim yellow lights glowing behind curtains. Inside, everything was meticulously arranged. The couch was centered perfectly against the wall. Shoes were lined up by size near the door. The kitchen counters were clear except for a coffee maker and a single mug. "You can put your bag there," Ryan said, pointing to a corner of the living room. Emily nodded and set her suitcase down. She waited for him to say "welcome home" or "make yourself comfortable," but he didn't. Instead, he walked into the kitchen and began rinsing a glass that already looked clean. She followed him, trying to fill the silence. "It's nice," she said, gesturing around the apartment. Ryan glanced up. "I like things simple." That night, they ordered takeout and ate at the small dining table. Ryan asked about her flight, about Arizona, about whether she was tired. The questions felt polite, almost rehearsed. When Emily laughed at something he said, he smiled, but his eyes didn't linger on her the way they had in photos or video calls. Later, as Emily unpacked in the guest room, Ryan had suggested she sleep there. Until she got settled, she felt a quiet unease she couldn't quite name. The room was clean but impersonal, the closet empty, the walls bare. It didn't feel like a space prepared for someone who was supposed to be starting a life there. The next morning, Ryan left early for work. Emily woke to the sound of the door closing and the sudden realization that she was alone in a place where she knew no one. She walked through the apartment slowly, opening cabinets, peering out the window. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. The silence pressed in on her. When Ryan returned that evening, he seemed tense, as if he were bracing himself. They talked about dinner plans. Emily suggested going out, seeing the city, but Ryan shook his head. "There's no need," he said. "We have everything here." As the days passed, small patterns began to emerge. Ryan liked to know where Emily was at all times. If she went to the store alone, he asked how long she'd be gone and texted if she didn't return when expected. When she mentioned wanting to explore downtown, he frowned slightly, reminding her that Ohio weather was unpredictable, that traffic could be bad. "You don't really need to go out," he said more than once. "You're safe here." The word safe landed oddly. Emily had never said she felt unsafe. Still, she nodded, not wanting to create tension so early on. In private moments, Emily noticed how carefully Ryan watched her reactions. If she rearranged something in the kitchen, he corrected it. If she laughed too loudly during a show, he turned the volume down. None of it was overtly hostile, but each moment carried a subtle message. This was his space, his order. One evening, Emily mentioned calling a friend back in Arizona. Ryan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're still talking to people there?" he asked. "Of course," she said. "They're my friends." Ryan didn't argue, but the air shifted. Later that night, when Emily stepped onto the balcony to take the call, she felt Ryan watching from inside, his silhouette framed by the living room light. Despite the discomfort, Emily tried to stay optimistic. She told herself that transitions were hard, that living together was always an adjustment. She reminded herself of the long conversations, the promises, the man who had seemed so understanding from afar. But in person, Ryan felt less like a partner and more like a presence she had to navigate carefully. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. Instead, he withdrew when displeased, creating a silence that felt heavy and punishing. The physical closeness between them remained tentative. Ryan waited, almost rigidly, for moments to escalate, while Emily hesitated, sensing an undercurrent she didn't fully understand. When he touched her, it felt deliberate, controlled, as if intimacy were something to be managed rather than shared. By the end of the first week, Emily felt a growing knot of anxiety in her chest. She missed the ease of her old routines, the freedom to come and go without explanation. She caught herself checking the time before making simple decisions, gauging how Ryan might react. One night, lying awake in the guest room, Emily stared at the ceiling and replayed their conversations from months earlier. She searched for signs she might have missed, red flags she had brushed aside in her desire for connection. From a distance, Ryan had felt calm and safe. Up close, that calm felt rigid, brittle, like something that could fracture under pressure. Still, she told herself it was too soon to judge. She had come here to try. To give something real a chance. She promised herself she wouldn't panic at the first sign of discomfort. But as the days blended together, Emily couldn't ignore the feeling that she had stepped into a life that left very little room for her to exist as herself. And beneath Ryan's careful manners and quiet routines, she sensed a need for control that unsettled her more with each passing day. She didn't yet know how quickly that unease would turn into fear. By the second week, the tension between them had grown dense enough to feel physical. It lived in the pauses between sentences, in the way Emily measured her words before speaking, in the careful distance Ryan maintained when he was displeased. Still, there was an unspoken expectation hanging over the apartment, something inevitable they were both circling without naming. That evening, Ryan suggested they stay in. He cooked dinner with quiet precision, moving through the kitchen as if following a script he'd rehearsed. Emily watched from the table, offering help that he politely declined. When they sat down to eat, he seemed calmer than he had been in days, his shoulders loosening, his voice steady again. "I want us to feel normal," he said, not looking up from his plate. "Like a real couple." Emily nodded. She wanted that too, or at least she wanted to want it. She told herself that closeness might soften the edges between them, that intimacy could bridge what words had failed to. After dinner, Ryan poured 2 glasses of wine. They sat on the couch, the television playing quietly in the background. When he reached for her hand, Emily let him. His grip was firm, almost deliberate, as if he were confirming something. They moved slowly, cautiously, into the bedroom Ryan used for himself. The room felt different from the guest room, more personal, but also more controlled. Everything had its place. The bed was neatly made, the nightstand bare except for a lamp and his phone. As they stood there, facing each other, Emily felt her pulse quicken, not with excitement, but with uncertainty. Ryan watched her closely, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to rush," he said. "We've waited this long." Emily gave a small smile. "Okay." What followed wasn't sudden or aggressive. It was quiet, restrained. But as the moment progressed, Emily felt her body tense, her thoughts racing. When she realized what Ryan was physically like, something far outside what she had expected, her breath caught in her throat. The shock was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't curiosity or surprise, it was fear. Her mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing, what her body was reacting to. She froze, muscles locking, heart pounding so hard she thought Ryan must hear it. Ryan noticed the change instantly. "What's wrong?" he asked. Emily tried to speak, but the words tangled in her mouth. She felt exposed, trapped between politeness and panic. This wasn't something she had prepared for, something she had consented to in her mind. Her sense of control evaporated in an instant. I can't," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "I'm not okay." Ryan's face tightened. "What do you mean you're not okay?" Emily pulled back slightly, wrapping her arms around herself, a reflexive attempt to create distance. "I need to stop. Please." For a moment, Ryan didn't move. He stared at her as if trying to decipher a foreign language. Then his jaw clenched. "Is this about me?" he asked. Emily shook her head quickly. "It's not about you being bad. I'm just overwhelmed. I didn't expect." She stopped herself, realizing how dangerous the rest of that sentence might sound. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Ryan exhaled sharply. "So you're rejecting me?" "That's not what I'm saying," Emily replied, panic creeping into her voice. "I just need time." Ryan stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides. The calm he had maintained cracked, replaced by something colder. "You flew across the country," he said. "You moved into my place. And now you're telling me you can't handle this?" Emily felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness but from fear. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know what to expect." Silence filled the room. Ryan turned away, pacing once, then stopping near the window. When he spoke again, his voice was low and controlled, but strained. "You're judging me," he said. Emily shook her head again, more urgently this time. "No. I'm scared. That's all." Ryan looked at her, really looked, as if measuring the distance between who he thought she was and who she was in that moment. Something dark flickered in his eyes, hurt, humiliation, anger tangled together. "I didn't choose this," he said. "You think I don't know how people react?" Emily realized then that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a wound he had carried long before she arrived, one that her reaction had torn open. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I just can't do this right now." Ryan nodded once, sharply. "Fine." He turned away, pulling on a shirt, his movements abrupt. Emily stood frozen, unsure whether to leave or speak, terrified of making things worse. When Ryan finally faced her again, his expression was blank. "You should sleep in the other room," he said. Emily gathered her things with shaking hands, her heart racing. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt the weight of his gaze on her back. The door to the guest room closed behind her with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the floor, trying to steady her breathing. Her body still felt locked in shock, her mind replaying the moment again and again. She felt foolish for not anticipating it, guilty for her reaction, terrified of what it might mean. In the hours that followed, Emily lay awake listening to the sounds of the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, Ryan's footsteps pacing in the other room. She wondered how something so private could have shifted everything so completely. The next morning, Ryan acted as if nothing had happened. He spoke politely, kept his tone neutral, avoided direct eye contact. The tension, however, was unmistakable. It pressed down on Emily with renewed intensity. When she tried to talk about it, Ryan dismissed her gently but firmly. "There's nothing to talk about," he said. "You made yourself clear." Emily felt a growing sense of dread. What she had hoped would be a moment of honesty had instead exposed something volatile beneath the surface. She realized that her vulnerability hadn't been met with understanding, but with wounded pride. That day, as Ryan left for work, Emily stood alone in the apartment, her suitcase still half unpacked in the corner of the guest room. She stared at it, the sight suddenly comforting. For the first time since arriving in Ohio, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might need to leave. What had begun as an attempt at closeness had instead revealed a fracture too deep to ignore. And Emily sensed, with a clarity that chilled her, that Ryan would not let this moment go easily. The morning after, the apartment felt different. The air was heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding on to what had happened. Emily moved quietly, aware of every sound she made, the soft click of the bathroom light, the faint creak of the floor beneath her feet. Ryan had already left for work without a word. No note. No text. Just absence. She stood in the guest room, staring at her open suitcase. Clothes she had folded with care now looked out of place, like evidence of a decision she was no longer sure she believed in. For the first time since arriving in Ohio, the truth settled clearly in her chest. She didn't feel safe here, not physically threatened yet, but emotionally cornered, watched, contained. Emily sat on the edge of the bed and replayed the night before. The shock. Her body freezing. Ryan's face when he realized she was pulling away. It wasn't just embarrassment she had seen in his eyes. It was something sharper. Something wounded and angry. She told herself she needed to leave before the tension hardened into something worse. When Ryan returned that evening, Emily was already bracing herself. He walked in, set his keys down, and nodded at her as if they were acquaintances sharing a space, not two people who had just crossed a point of no return. They ate dinner in near silence. Ryan scrolled through his phone. Emily barely touched her food. "I think I should go," she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. Ryan didn't look up. "Go where?" "A hotel," she replied. "Just for a bit. I need space to think." That got his attention. He set the phone down slowly. "You're overreacting." "I'm not," Emily said. "I'm overwhelmed. This isn't what I expected, and I need time." Ryan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "So you're running?" Emily felt her chest tighten. "I'm choosing what's right for me." Ryan let out a short laugh, humorless. "You came all this way just to decide you can't handle reality?" She swallowed. "This isn't about handling anything. I don't feel comfortable." The word comfortable seemed to irritate him more than anger would have. His jaw clenched. "You could have said something earlier," he said. "You let me think we were building something." "I did say something," Emily replied. "Last night." Ryan stood abruptly, pushing his chair back. "You rejected me," he said. "That's what you did." Emily stayed seated, forcing herself not to shrink under his gaze. "I asked to stop." "That's not rejection. That's a boundary." Ryan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away, pacing the length of the living room. Emily watched him carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands curled into fists and relaxed again. "So what?" he said finally. "You leave, tell your friends some story about me, and I'm the bad guy?" Emily shook her head. "I'm not telling anyone anything. I just want to go." The silence that followed felt dangerous, not loud, not explosive, but dense. Ryan's eyes flicked toward her phone on the table, then back to her face. "You don't have to make this dramatic," he said. "Stay. We can pretend it didn't happen." Emily stood. "I can't." That night, she packed everything. She moved quickly but carefully, folding clothes with hands that trembled despite her efforts to stay calm. Ryan watched from the doorway, saying nothing, his presence pressing against her like a weight. When she zipped the suitcase closed, Ryan finally spoke. "You're making a mistake." Emily met his eyes. "Maybe," she said. "But it's my mistake to make." She ordered a rideshare and waited near the door, her heart pounding with every passing second. When the driver texted that he was outside, relief washed over her so intensely it almost made her dizzy. As she reached for the door handle, Ryan spoke again, his voice low. "You know I didn't lie to you." Emily paused. "This isn't about lies," she said. "It's about how I feel." He didn't respond. She stepped outside, the cool Ohio air hitting her face like a shock. The door closed behind her with a finality that made her chest ache. The hotel room was small but clean, the anonymity comforting. Emily locked the door, slid the chain into place, and sank onto the bed. Only then did her body begin to shake. She texted her closest friend a single sentence, "I left. I'm safe for now." For a few hours, the world seemed to slow. Emily ordered room service. She barely ate. She watched television without absorbing anything. She tried to sleep but couldn't, her mind replaying Ryan's words, his expression, the way he had framed her choice as betrayal. Her phone buzzed just after midnight. "Ryan, we need to talk." She didn't respond. Another message followed minutes later. "Ryan, you're misunderstanding everything." Emily turned the phone face down. By morning, the messages had multiplied. Apologies mixed with accusations. Promises blurred into resentment. Emily realized then that leaving the apartment hadn't ended anything. It had only shifted the conflict into a space she couldn't see. Still, she felt certain of one thing: staying would have been worse. She booked a return flight, choosing the earliest one she could manage. As she packed again, this time with purpose, she told herself she just needed to get home. Back to familiar ground. Back to safety. What she didn't know was that Ryan wasn't ready to accept her departure as final. And the decision she believed would protect her had already ignited something inside him that refusal alone could not extinguish. At first, Emily believed distance would bring clarity. From the safety of the hotel room, Ryan's apartment already felt like a sealed chapter, uncomfortable, unsettling, but closed. She told herself that once she was back in Arizona, the tension would dissolve into memory. All she had to do was endure a few more days. Ryan did not see it that way. The messages began before sunrise. Short at first. "Careful. I didn't sleep. We need to clear this up." Emily read them without replying. She reminded herself that silence was a boundary too. But by mid-morning, the tone shifted. "You can't just disappear. I deserve an explanation." Her phone vibrated again and again, the screen lighting up like a pulse she couldn't slow. She turned it off, then turned it back on, afraid of what she might miss. When she checked again, there were missed calls, 4, then 7, each timestamp closer together than the last. Ryan's need to talk wasn't about understanding. Emily felt that clearly now. It was about restoring control. When she finally replied, she chose her words carefully. "I'm not coming back. I've booked a flight. Please stop contacting me." The response came instantly. "So that's it? You humiliate me and walk away?" Emily's chest tightened. She typed, erased, typed again. "I didn't humiliate you. I asked to stop. That's all." Several minutes passed. She hoped, foolishly, that he would accept it. Instead, the next message cut sharper. "You knew exactly what you were doing." That was when fear replaced uncertainty. Ryan's texts grew longer, more erratic. Apologies tangled with blame. He wrote about how hard it had been for him, how people always judged him, how she had promised him something just by coming there. He reminded her of the flight, the boxes she'd packed, the nights they'd talked about building a life together. "You don't get to decide this alone," he wrote. Emily stopped responding altogether. She blocked his number, then his social media accounts. For a brief moment, the silence felt like relief. It didn't last. That afternoon, the hotel front desk called her room. "There's a gentleman asking for you," the clerk said. "Says he's a friend." Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. "What's his name?" "Ryan Mitchell." Her hands began to shake. "Please tell him I'm not available," she said. "And I don't want any visitors." The clerk hesitated. He seemed upset. "Please," Emily said. "Just tell him to leave." She locked the door again, even though it was already locked. She pulled the curtains shut and sat on the bed, phone clutched in her hand, listening for sounds in the hallway. Every footstep made her flinch. Ryan's obsession was no longer contained to a screen. It had found her. By evening, messages began arriving from unknown numbers. The words were familiar, the tone unmistakable. "You can't hide from me. I just want to talk. Why are you doing this to me?" Emily felt trapped in a shrinking circle. She called her friend back in Arizona, her voice cracking as she explained. "He's not letting it go," she said. "I think he followed me." Her friend urged her to call the police, but Emily hesitated. Ryan hadn't threatened her directly. He hadn't hurt her. Not yet. She worried she wouldn't be taken seriously, that she'd be told to block the numbers and wait it out. What she didn't understand yet was that rejection had become something else inside Ryan, something corrosive. For Ryan, Emily's departure wasn't just a loss. It was exposure. Her reaction had touched the deepest part of his identity, the place where shame lived. In his mind, she wasn't just leaving, she was carrying his secret with her, proof of a vulnerability he had spent years defending against. Every unanswered message felt like confirmation that he had been judged, discarded, diminished. He began to rewrite the story in his head. Emily hadn't been scared, he told himself. She had been cruel. Calculating. She had used him, taken advantage of his honesty, then fled when reality appeared. The more he repeated it, the more righteous his anger felt. That night, Emily moved hotels without telling anyone. She checked in under her middle name and paid cash. She told herself she was being paranoid, but paranoia felt safer than denial. Still, Ryan found her again. This time, it was a voicemail. His voice was calm, eerily steady. "I know you're upset," he said. "But you don't get to just erase me. We owe each other a conversation." Emily deleted it without listening twice. By the next morning, she felt exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. She checked out early and went to the airport hours ahead of her flight, choosing a seat where she could see the entrances. Every man who walked past made her stomach twist. Her phone buzzed one last time. "I'm sorry," Ryan wrote. "I just need to see you once." To explain. Emily stared at the message until her vision blurred. She didn't reply. She powered the phone down completely and slid it into her bag. As the plane lifted off, she felt a rush of relief so strong it brought tears to her eyes. Ohio shrank beneath the clouds, and with it, she hoped, the reach of a man who refused to let go. She didn't know that Ryan was already planning his next move. That distance, rather than calming him, had hardened his resolve. In his mind, Emily's refusal wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the story turned against her. Emily thought the flight home would end it. As the plane crossed state lines, she allowed herself to believe that distance would finally break Ryan's grip, that whatever had been unleashed by her refusal would fade once she was out of reach. By the time she landed, exhaustion dulled her fear into something quieter, something she mistook for safety. She was wrong. The first message arrived while she was waiting for her luggage. "We need to talk. In person." She didn't know how he had the number again. She didn't ask. Her body reacted before her mind could, heart racing, palms slick with sweat. She turned her phone off and focused on the steady rhythm of the conveyor belt, telling herself that coincidence didn't equal danger, that paranoia had been feeding on her nerves for days. She checked into a short-term rental near the airport instead of going straight home. It was temporary, she told herself. Just a buffer. She wanted a few nights of sleep before facing the questions she knew would come, friends, family, explanations she wasn't ready to give. The first night passed quietly. The second did not. Emily was returning from the corner store when she noticed a car idling across the street. The engine was running, headlights off. She told herself not to jump to conclusions. Lots of cars sat like that. Lots of people waited for someone. As she reached the front door, she heard her name. Emily. Her blood turned cold. Ryan stepped out of the car, his face half lit by a street lamp. He looked thinner, more drawn than she remembered. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, as if he'd been living in motion rather than rest. "What are you doing here?" she asked, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. "Talking," he said. "Like I asked." Emily took a step back, keys clenched in her hand. "You need to leave." He shook his head slowly, as if disappointed. "You ran again." "I asked you to stop," she said. This is harassment. Ryan's jaw tightened. You don't get to decide that. She glanced toward the door, then back at him. I'm calling the police. Ryan laughed softly. Not amused. Hurt. You really want to do that? After everything? Everything is over, Emily said. You need to accept that. For a moment, he just stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. You came into my life, he said. You crossed a line. You don't get to pretend this never happened. Emily felt her fears sharpen into clarity. This wasn't about closure. It never had been. I didn't promise you anything, she said. I said no. That should have been enough. Ryan stepped closer. Emily backed away until she felt the door against her spine. You embarrassed me, he said. You looked at me like I was a mistake. That's not true, she said, even as she realized the truth didn't matter anymore. Ryan's eyes flicked to her phone, still in her hand. Who have you told? No one, Emily said. And I don't owe you an answer. His breathing quickened. You're lying. I'm not, she said. But even if I were, it's not your concern. The tension snapped. Ryan moved suddenly, blocking her path to the door. Emily raised her voice, hoping someone might hear. Get away from me, she said. Right now. Lower your voice, he snapped. You don't need to make a scene. I do, she replied. Because you won't leave. Ryan's expression shifted, anger flickering into something more frantic. I just want you to understand, he said. You can't just reject someone like that and expect nothing to happen. Emily felt a surge of anger break through her fear. I'm allowed to say no, she said. That's not rejection. That's my right. Ryan's face darkened. You think you're better than me? That's not what this is, Emily said. Please. Just go. For a moment, she thought he might. His shoulders sagged slightly, his gaze dropping to the pavement. Hope flared, fragile and brief. Then he looked up. If I can't have my say, he said, then neither can you. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Emily felt a sudden, instinctive urge to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape the gravity pulling her toward him. She shoved past him, keys digging into her palm as she ran. Ryan grabbed her arm. Let go, she yelled, struggling against his grip. Stop, he said, panic and fury tangled in his voice. Just stop. What happened next unfolded too fast for Emily to fully process. Her balance faltered. She felt the sharp jolt of impact, the breath knocked from her lungs. Sounds blurred, her own voice, Ryan's, the distant hum of traffic, melding into something indistinct and terrifying. When it was over, there was silence. Ryan stood frozen, staring down at what he had done. His chest heaved, his mind racing ahead to consequences he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. The confrontation he had insisted on had slipped beyond his control, turning into something irreversible. Emily lay still, the night pressing in around her. Moments later, someone screamed. A light flicked on. Footsteps approached. Ryan stumbled backward, panic finally overtaking rage. He fled into the darkness, leaving behind a scene that could not be undone. Sirens cut through the quiet minutes later, sharp and accusing. Neighbors gathered, whispering, pointing. Paramedics moved quickly, professionally, their faces grim. By the time police tracked Ryan down hours later, the story he had built in his head had collapsed. The messages, the travel records, the witnesses, all of it painted a picture he could no longer outrun. For Emily, the final confrontation lasted only minutes. For Ryan, it would define the rest of his life. And for everyone left behind, it would stand as a brutal reminder of how refusal, when met with obsession and wounded pride, can turn deadly. The night did not end with the confrontation. It settled into a silence that felt wrong, too still for what had just occurred. The space where Emily had stood moments earlier now held only scattered details: keys on the pavement, a dropped bag, the harsh glow of a porch light cutting across the sidewalk. Neighbors would later say the quiet afterward was what unsettled them most. Emily was still breathing when help arrived. Paramedics moved quickly, their voices clipped and professional as they assessed her injuries. She did not respond. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, as if she were looking past the night and into something far away. The stretcher slid into place, straps tightened, hands steady but urgent. Someone said her name. Someone else called time. Ryan was already gone. He drove without a destination, headlights slicing through empty streets, his mind skipping between denial and dread. He told himself it had been an accident, that things had escalated, that she had fallen. The story changed with every mile. What didn't change was the image replaying in his head, the moment when control slipped completely, when the confrontation he insisted on crossed into something final. At the hospital, doctors worked in silence. Machines hummed. A nurse adjusted a monitor. A physician shook his head almost imperceptibly. Emily's injuries were catastrophic. The damage had been done before the sirens ever sounded. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Police officers began their work at the scene, moving carefully, documenting everything. The dropped keys. The scuff marks near the door. A neighbor's security camera that had caught the figures moving in and out of frame, the sudden blur of motion, the aftermath. Another camera down the block recorded a car speeding away moments later. Detectives reviewed the footage before dawn. They already knew who they were looking for. Ryan was located the next morning at a rest stop several hours away. He sat in his car, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. When officers approached, he did not resist. He looked tired, hollowed out, like someone who had been awake too long with thoughts that would not quiet. At the station, he asked only one question. "Is she okay?" No one answered right away. When a detective finally spoke, his voice was even. "Emily Carter is dead." Ryan's face drained of color. He stared at the table, blinking rapidly, as if the words needed time to reach him. When they did, his shoulders sagged, and a low sound escaped his throat, not quite a sob, not quite a breath. "I didn't mean to," he said. "I just wanted her to listen." The interrogation unfolded slowly. Ryan talked in fragments, circling the same points. He said she had misunderstood him. He said he was trying to explain himself. He said everything had spiraled too fast. When confronted with the messages, the travel records, the footage, his explanations collapsed into silence. What remained was motive laid bare. Emily's refusal had struck a place Ryan could not protect. In his mind, her reaction was not a boundary but an exposure, a threat to the image he had constructed of himself. The more she pulled away, the more he felt erased. Confronting her had been his attempt to reclaim something: respect, dignity, control. Instead, it ended her life. News of the murder spread quickly. Friends back in Arizona struggled to reconcile the woman they knew, careful, thoughtful, cautious, with the circumstances of her death. They replayed her messages, the ones that spoke of unease, of needing space, of something that felt wrong but hadn't yet found words. Her family arrived days later, walking through a city that meant nothing to them, trying to understand how a decision made in hope had led here. They sat with detectives, listened to timelines, nodded through explanations that felt clinical and insufficient. There were no answers that could make sense of the loss. The evidence was overwhelming. The messages showed escalation. The footage showed pursuit. The witnesses confirmed the confrontation. Ryan was charged with murder, held without bail, his face expressionless as he was led into court for the first time. In the courtroom, Emily was described in careful language: her work, her independence, her plans. The prosecution spoke of a pattern, of obsession fueled by rejection, of a man who refused to accept no as an ending. The defense would later argue emotional distress, loss of control. The facts remained unchanged. Emily Carter had tried to leave. She had done what countless people are told to do when something feels wrong: create distance, set boundaries, choose safety. For that, she was pursued, confronted, and killed. The murder was not a moment of rage alone. It was the final act of a fixation that began the instant Ryan decided her refusal was something he could not live with. In that decision, her autonomy became a threat. In his need to confront it, her life was taken. Long after the scene was cleared and the headlines faded, the truth of the case remained stark and unforgiving. This was not about love gone wrong. It was about control denied, and the devastating consequences when denial is met with obsession. Emily's story ended in violence, but it began with trust. And in the space between those two truths lies the warning no verdict can undo. Dawn revealed what the night had tried to hide. Yellow tape cordoned off the narrow stretch of sidewalk outside the rental, fluttering lightly in the early morning air. The porch light was still on, casting a pale cone over the place where Emily had fallen. A single shoe lay near the curb. Her keys had been collected and tagged. Neighbors stood in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones, replaying fragments of what they thought they'd heard: raised voices, a sudden movement, then nothing. For the officers who arrived first, the scene was quiet but precise. Nothing appeared random. The position of objects, the scuff marks near the door, the camera angles, each detail suggested a confrontation that escalated quickly and decisively. The responding detective, Lieutenant Marcus Hale, took in the scene without comment. Years on the job had taught him to read absence as much as presence. At the hospital, Emily's death was documented in careful, clinical language. Time of death. Cause. The words felt inadequate for the life they represented. A nurse who had spoken to Emily's family earlier that morning sat for a moment after her shift ended, staring at her hands, trying to process the speed with which everything had happened. By mid-morning, the investigation had gathered momentum. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors, collecting statements. One neighbor mentioned seeing a man pacing near the property earlier that evening. Another recalled a car idling with its lights off. A third had security footage that showed a brief, chaotic encounter: figures moving in and out of frame, a sudden lurch, then a man running toward a parked car. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. At headquarters, the evidence board filled quickly. Photos of the scene. A still from the video. A timeline constructed from phone records, rideshare data, hotel logs. Emily's name sat at the center, surrounded by lines pointing outward, each connection tracing the final days of her life. Ryan Mitchell's name appeared repeatedly. Investigators pulled his phone records. The volume of messages told a story before anyone read a single word. Dozens, then hundreds, sent after Emily left Ohio. Calls placed minutes apart. Voicemails left after blocks were imposed. Numbers masked. Accounts created. Each attempt showed escalation, persistence, refusal to accept silence. Detective Hale listened to the voicemails in order, his expression tightening as Ryan's tone shifted, from pleading to accusatory, from apologetic to entitled. The progression was textbook. The kind of pattern officers hoped to interrupt before it reached this point. Too late. Emily's friends were interviewed that afternoon. They spoke of her caution, her independence, her unease in the days before her death. One friend produced screenshots of messages Emily had sent from the hotel, short, anxious notes about needing space, about being followed, about wanting to get home as soon as possible. She said something felt off, the friend told investigators, her voice shaking. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She just wanted out. Travel records confirmed Ryan's movements. He had left Ohio shortly after Emily did, driving for hours without rest. License plate readers placed his car near the rental that evening. Gas station receipts mapped his route with impersonal accuracy. Each stop narrowed the window, tightening the narrative into something unavoidable. When Ryan was brought in for questioning, he appeared subdued, almost resigned. He asked for water. He rubbed his hands together. He stared at the table as if it might offer guidance. Detectives began with facts. "You traveled here without telling her," Hale said. You waited outside the property. Ryan nodded faintly. I just wanted to talk. You contacted her after she told you to stop. I needed closure. You blocked her from leaving. Ryan's jaw tightened. She wouldn't listen. The interview room fell quiet. Hale let the silence do its work. When confronted with the footage, Ryan's shoulders slumped. He didn't deny being there. He didn't deny the confrontation. He clung to the idea that it had been an accident, that emotions had overwhelmed him, that he never intended for it to end this way. Intent, the detectives knew, would be argued later. For now, the sequence mattered. And the sequence was clear. Emily had tried to leave. Ryan had pursued. The encounter had turned physical. The outcome was fatal. As the investigation unfolded, a fuller picture of Emily emerged, her career, her plans, the life she was returning to. Emails showed projects she'd lined up. Notes on her phone listed errands she'd planned for the week she never reached. A calendar reminder for a friend's birthday sat unread. Her family arrived 2 days later. They sat across from detectives in a quiet room, absorbing information in fragments. They asked the same questions over and over, not because they hadn't heard the answers, but because the answers refused to settle. Why didn't he just leave her alone? Her mother asked. No one had a response that would bring comfort. The charging documents were prepared with methodical care. Murder. Stalking. Harassment. Each count reflected a step in the escalation that led to Emily's death. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence late into the night, ensuring the case was airtight. There would be no shortcuts. No ambiguity. At the arraignment, Ryan stood silently as the charges were read. He did not look toward the gallery. He did not speak. The judge denied bail, citing the severity of the crime and the risk demonstrated by Ryan's actions. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Headlines framed the story in stark terms. Friends of Emily spoke briefly, asking for privacy, urging others to listen when someone says they're scared, to take refusal seriously. Behind the scenes, the investigation continued. Digital forensics recovered deleted messages. Analysts reconstructed timelines down to the minute. Every piece reinforced the same conclusion: this was not a sudden, inexplicable act. It was the culmination of fixation, fueled by wounded pride and entitlement. Detective Hale closed the file late one evening, the evidence stacked neatly, the narrative complete. He had seen cases like this before, though none ever felt routine. The details changed. The ending did not. Emily Carter's death was no longer a mystery. The facts had been established. The path from decision to disaster was laid out in precise, unforgiving lines. What remained was accountability, and the long process of turning evidence into justice for a woman whose only mistake had been believing she was allowed to walk away. As the investigation moved from urgency to clarity, the story of Emily Carter's final weeks began to emerge in full, unforgiving detail. What had once been fragments, messages, sightings, timelines, now aligned into a single, coherent truth. There were no gaps left to hide in. No alternate explanations that could soften what had happened. The digital evidence told the story first. Forensic analysts reconstructed Emily's phone activity minute by minute. Her messages shifted in tone as the days passed, hopeful at first, then cautious, then unmistakably fearful. She asked for space. She set boundaries. She said no, clearly and repeatedly. Each refusal was met with a surge of response from Ryan, more messages, more calls, more attempts to force a conversation she did not want. Deleted texts were recovered from Ryan's devices. Some were apologetic. Others were accusatory. Several revealed a fixation that hardened with every unanswered message. He wrote about humiliation. About being judged. About not being allowed to explain himself. The language was revealing not for its anger, but for its entitlement, an insistence that Emily owed him access, understanding, resolution. She owed him nothing. The evidence made that plain. Investigators compared Ryan's words to his actions. The pattern was consistent. When Emily blocked him, he created new numbers. When she changed hotels, he tracked her movements. When she left the state, he followed. The distance that should have ended the relationship only intensified his need to reassert control. Witness statements added weight to the digital trail. The hotel clerk described Ryan's insistence, his refusal to accept that Emily did not want to see him. A neighbor near the rental recalled seeing him pacing, stopping cars, checking his phone repeatedly as if waiting for permission that never came. Another witness heard Emily's voice, raised, urgent, followed by a sudden shift in tone that still echoed in their memory. She sounded scared, the witness said. Not angry. Just scared. Emily's friends painted a portrait of a woman trying to extricate herself carefully, responsibly. She didn't want drama. She didn't want revenge. She wanted out. One friend shared a message Emily had sent just hours before the confrontation. I think he's not going to let this go. If anything happens, please remember I tried to leave. The words landed heavily in the interview room. Ryan's version of events unraveled under scrutiny. He claimed he wanted closure, but his actions showed pursuit. He claimed he felt misled, but the messages revealed Emily's honesty. He said he lost control in a moment of emotional overload, but the planning, the travel, the waiting, the confrontation, told a different story. Prosecutors focused on that distinction. This was not an impulsive misunderstanding. It was a series of choices. Each choice narrowed the outcome. When Ryan was confronted with the full scope of the evidence, he fell silent. The entitlement that had fueled his pursuit could not withstand the clarity of the record. In private moments, he expressed confusion, not about what he had done, but about why Emily hadn't stayed. Why she hadn't softened her refusal. Why she hadn't protected his feelings. The truth, once revealed, was stark. Emily's autonomy had collided with Ryan's need for control. And control, when denied, had turned lethal. As the case prepared for trial, experts weighed in on the dynamics at play. They spoke about obsession masquerading as devotion, about shame transformed into aggression, about the danger that arises when rejection is treated as an injustice rather than a boundary. None of it excused what happened. It explained the path that led there. Emily's family listened to these explanations with quiet resolve. Understanding the mechanics of the crime did not lessen the loss, but it affirmed what they already knew about her. She had not been reckless. She had not provoked violence. She had done what she was told to do, leave when something felt wrong. The public narrative shifted as more details became known. Headlines stopped using words like romantic dispute and began naming the behavior for what it was: stalking, harassment, a refusal to accept no. Advocacy groups spoke out, emphasizing how often warning signs are minimized until it's too late. Inside the courthouse, the truth continued to solidify. Timelines were finalized. Exhibits were labeled. The story that would be presented to a jury was not sensational. It was methodical, grounded in facts that left little room for doubt. Emily Carter had been clear. She had been consistent. She had been afraid, and justified in that fear. The truth did not offer comfort, but it offered clarity. It stripped away excuses and illusions, leaving only the reality of a life cut short by someone who believed his need outweighed her right to walk away. As the case moved toward trial, there was no longer any question about what had happened. The only question that remained was how the system would respond, how it would measure accountability for a crime rooted not in love, but in the refusal to let go. The courtroom was full long before the judge entered. Reporters lined the back rows, notebooks open, cameras waiting for a moment that would never truly capture what was at stake. Emily Carter's family sat together near the front, their posture rigid, faces drawn tight with restraint. Across the aisle, Ryan Mitchell sat beside his defense attorney, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. When the judge called the room to order, the air shifted. This was no longer an investigation. This was judgment. The prosecution opened with facts, not flourishes. The lead prosecutor spoke evenly, laying out the timeline step by step: the meeting, the rejection, the escalation, the pursuit. She did not raise her voice when she described Emily's attempts to leave, or Ryan's refusal to accept it. She let the evidence speak. This case, she told the jury, is about what happens when a man decides that a woman's no is not an answer, but a challenge. Screens lit up with text messages. One after another, they appeared, pleas turning to accusations, apologies curdling into entitlement. Jurors leaned forward, reading along as Ryan's words revealed a mindset that refused to accept separation. The prosecution called Emily's friends to the stand. They spoke quietly, carefully, as if still afraid of overstating anything. One described the excitement Emily had felt before the trip. Another recounted the fear in her voice during their last phone call. She wasn't angry, one friend testified. She was scared. She kept saying she just needed to get away. Hotel employees followed. The clerk who had turned Ryan away described his insistence, his agitation, the way he refused to accept that Emily did not want to see him. Surveillance footage was shown again, Ryan pacing, checking his phone, waiting. Then came the expert testimony. A forensic psychologist explained how rejection can trigger obsessive behavior in individuals who tie their identity to control. She spoke about entitlement disguised as vulnerability, about how shame can morph into aggression when a person believes they are owed access to another human being. This wasn't a loss of control, the psychologist said. It was an attempt to regain it. The defense strategy was clear from the start. Ryan's attorney argued emotional distress, humiliation, a momentary breakdown. He emphasized Ryan's lack of prior violent history. He spoke of misunderstanding, of feelings spiraling out of control. Ryan took the stand late in the trial. He spoke softly, haltingly. He said he loved Emily. He said he felt blindsided by her reaction. He said he only wanted to explain himself, to be heard. When asked why he followed her after she told him to stop, he struggled to answer. "I didn't think she meant it," he said finally. "I thought if we talked, she'd understand." The prosecutor approached calmly. "She told you no, didn't she?" she asked. Ryan nodded. "She blocked your number?" "Yes." "She left the state?" "Yes." "And you followed her anyway?" Ryan hesitated. "I needed closure." The prosecutor's voice sharpened slightly. "Closure is not something you take. And it does not require pursuit." The courtroom was silent. In closing arguments, the prosecution returned to the core truth of the case. Emily had done everything right. She had recognized danger. She had left. She had asked to be left alone. The law, the prosecutor reminded the jury, protects that choice. She was not reckless, she said. She was responsible. And for that, she was punished by a man who believed her autonomy was an offense. The defense urged the jury to consider intent, to see Ryan as a man overwhelmed by emotion rather than driven by control. They asked for mercy. Deliberations lasted less than a day. When the jury returned, Emily's mother gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ryan stared straight ahead, unmoving. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty. A sound escaped from the gallery, not a cheer, not a cry, but something raw and involuntary. Ryan closed his eyes. His shoulders slumped. At sentencing, the judge spoke plainly. "This court recognizes that rejection is painful," he said. "But pain does not grant permission to pursue, intimidate, or harm. You chose to ignore clear boundaries. You chose confrontation. You chose violence." Ryan was sentenced to decades in prison. There would be no early release, no second chance at freedom that mattered. As deputies led him away, he glanced once toward Emily's family. Her mother did not look back. Outside the courthouse, sunlight fell across the steps, indifferent and bright. Reporters asked questions. Advocates spoke about warning signs, about believing women when they say they are afraid. Inside, the courtroom emptied, leaving behind only echoes. The trial was over. The truth had been spoken aloud, recorded, affirmed. It could not bring Emily back. but it named what had been done to her, and held accountable the man who refused to let her walk away. The courtroom emptied slowly, as if no one was ready to step back into a world that felt unchanged by what had just been decided. The verdict had been read, the sentence imposed, the law satisfied. What remained was quieter and heavier, the kind of aftermath that does not announce itself, but settles into lives and stays. Emily Carter's family returned home with a verdict that could never feel like closure. In Arizona, her apartment still carried traces of the life she had been building, a half-finished notebook on the kitchen counter, a jacket draped over a chair, unread mail stacked neatly by the door. They moved through the space carefully, touching things as if they might still be warm. Each object asked the same unanswerable question: how a woman so deliberate, so cautious, could be taken so suddenly. They spoke about Emily in the present tense longer than anyone noticed. She is careful. She is thoughtful. She is the one who calls to check in. Grief does not correct grammar, it resists endings. Friends gathered quietly in the weeks that followed. They shared stories that did not fit neatly into headlines: Emily's dry humor, her habit of over-preparing for trips, the way she listened more than she spoke. They talked about the messages she sent when something felt wrong, how she tried to leave without making noise, without provoking anger. Many of them carried guilt they could not put down, replaying conversations, wondering if they could have insisted harder, acted faster. The truth, though, was simple and cruel: Emily had done what people are told to do. She trusted her instincts. She set boundaries. She left. Ryan Mitchell began his sentence in a place stripped of illusion. Prison life reduced everything to routine: counts, meals, silence. The man who once demanded to be heard now existed in a system that did not care about explanations. In private moments, he would speak of misunderstanding, of emotions that spiraled, of a single moment that changed everything. What he did not speak of, at least not publicly, was the choice that came before that moment, the decision to pursue rather than let go. There were no appeals that altered the outcome. The record was too clear. The evidence too complete. Over time, Ryan's name faded from the news, reappearing only in legal databases and annual reports. Accountability, once delivered, rarely stays visible. Emily's name did not fade as easily. Advocacy groups reached out to her family, asking permission to share her story, not for spectacle, but for clarity. They spoke about patterns: how obsession often follows rejection, how control can hide behind vulnerability, how just wanting to talk can escalate into something far more dangerous. Emily's case became a reference point, cited in trainings and discussions about stalking and intimate partner violence. Her family agreed to speak, carefully and sparingly. They did not want Emily remembered only for how she died. They wanted her remembered for how she lived, and for the fact that her final decision was an act of self-preservation, not provocation. Years passed. Life continued in altered shapes. Birthdays were marked quietly. Holidays carried an empty place at the table. Time softened some edges but sharpened others. The loss did not diminish, it integrated. What lingered most was the understanding that this story did not begin with violence. It began with trust. With hope. With a decision to believe someone who sounded safe. The danger did not announce itself loudly. It arrived through small signals: discomfort dismissed, boundaries questioned, a refusal treated as an insult. Emily's story ended because one man decided that his need outweighed her right to leave. The law called it murder. The community called it preventable. For those who knew her, it was something even simpler: a life interrupted by entitlement that would not accept no. In the end, there were no grand conclusions, no lessons that neatly resolved the grief. Only a truth that remained, steady and unyielding: autonomy is not negotiable. Refusal is not cruelty. And walking away is not an invitation to be followed. Emily Carter tried to leave quietly. She deserved to succeed.